Nobody pushed me.
There's no quid pro quo at all.
I need a favor, though. Investigate Biden.
In other words, no pressure.
What do a former comedian, an ex-reality TV star, and the son of a former vice president all have in common? They're biding their time. I'm sorry, I really am, but hello, and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today I'm talking about that god-awful joke and why it sprouted a once forbidden fruit. You guessed it, impeachment. The House inquiry is underway, and by now, you've likely heard a lot about President Donald Trump's phone calls, Joe Biden's son, Hunter, and why a TV president turned actual president is now at the very center of America's political fortunes. Let the speculation and horse trading continue. For this show, I'm going to offer something a bit better than that and take a deeper look into the place where America's impeachment process actually began, Ukraine. And today, I have with me a woman who was not only born in Ukraine's capital city of Kiev, where I lived for almost a year, but is also an expert on that foreboding triangle of Russia, Europe, and U.S. relations, Dr. Alina Polyakova. Don't worry, I've also got your puppet regime.
All of Europe is more or less one country now.
England joined the continent? This is madness.
But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on. It's the poorest country in Europe. Move over Moldova. Don't even think about it, Greece. At its current growth rate, it'll take Ukraine more than 50 years to reach income levels comparable to even Poland. An over-reliance on commodity exports, weak institutions, and a war with Russian-backed separatists haven't exactly made Ukraine a safe space for foreign investment. The average Ukrainian earns about $385 a month, often working within industries still run by corrupt oligarchs. Meanwhile, government coffers rely on foreign aid, and a crippling pension deficit accounts for more than 6% of the country's entire GDP. That cocktail of problems can lead a man to drink, and Ukrainians do. The nation ranks 6th globally in overall alcohol consumption. Why am I telling you all this? Well, because in such despair, there are often opportunities, especially when the line between business and politics is blurred. Many of America's shadiest dealings have run through this former Soviet republic, nestled at Europe's crossroads of East and West. And it is a country that has often paid well to shape American opinion. Just ask former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, currently in prison on a fraud conviction, but whose lucrative political consulting in Ukraine earned him millions. Or Rudy Giuliani, Trump's personal attorney and a central player in the impeachment inquiry. He's had business ties in Ukraine for about a decade. And no, it's not just about Republicans. Remember Greg Craig? And beware of anyone with two first names. He's a former White House counsel under President Obama, and his firm netted $4 million after preparing a report for the Ukrainian government about the trial of its president's chief rival. These days, that particular Ukraine president is in exile in Russia and wanted for high treason in Ukraine. But I digress. Let's look at Viktor Pinchuk, a big-time steel magnate married to the daughter of another former Ukrainian president. Pinchuk put an American named Doug Schoen on a $40,000 monthly retainer. Not bad. The Harvard law grad managed to grease the wheels enough with the Clintons for a high-level meeting. Pinchuk even later attended Bill Clinton's 65th birthday party in LA and eventually donated over $10 million to the Clinton Foundation. To be fair, he also donated $150,000 to Trump's foundation for this speech.
The fact is that Ukraine is an amazing place. You know, I've known so many people, so many years in the Ukraine.
Ukraine somehow keeps coming up in the dark corners of American politics. And the big concern, dare I say it, is corruption. An Ernst & Young survey considered Ukraine most corrupt place on earth, as its natural resources, culture of graft, and inside dealings have long made it a target for those with political connections and an appetite for cash. So is it really any surprise that the son of a former U.S. vice president could earn $50,000 a month by serving on the board of a Ukrainian energy company when he had virtually no relevant experience? That's how business is done.
And you know what? Did I make a mistake? Well, maybe in the grand scheme of things, yeah. What I regret is not taking into account that there would be a Rudy Giuliani and a president of the United States that would be listening to this ridiculous conspiracy idea.
And then President Trump uses the office of the president to ask for a favor of Ukraine's new leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, to investigate his political rival, possibly withholding military aid to Ukraine to emphasize the point. In the United States, that was enough for Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats to kick off the impeachment process. Now, in Ukraine, sort of thing barely scratches the surface, but that doesn't mean Ukrainians have to like it. Remember, President Zelensky may be a former comedian, in fact, he is, but he also rode an anti-establishment, anti-corruption wave to power.
That's basically what Schroeder did.
Basically, he was up to his eyeballs in this. Alina Polyakova, wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
So you're from Ukraine, which means you've been pretty busy of late. I want to start right with the phone call. You obviously saw the transcript, the non-transcript transcript,
Right.
the same one that we all did. What were your immediate takeaways as you were reading through the summation of the conversation between the Ukrainian President Zelensky and Trump?
The immediate takeaway from the transcript, to my mind, is that the US president is clearly trying to get the Ukrainians to do something for him in exchange for US support of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians seem to constantly be trying to drive the conversation towards more diplomatic matters like defense and diplomacy and things like that. Yet Trump keeps pulling them back in to want to talk about the investigation into Joe Biden and his son's dealings in Ukraine.
There was a lot of, yes, of course, this is a real problem. We'll look into it. I mean, when you watched that, did you think to yourself, this Ukrainian president, he's under a lot of pressure. The U.S. is a lot bigger. He's going to do anything possible just to make Trump happy.
Yeah, I felt terrible for Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. You know, he's young, he's new, and you have...
Has no political experience.
Has no political experience.
He was a comedian and TV star before he
That's right,
became
exactly.
president.
I think he was hoping to have a very good personal relationship with Trump because, you know, they both come from television, they're not politicians. There's a lot that, you know, could produce a good, positive personal relationship. And I think that was Zelensky's main task all along. And so we have this press conference from September in which you have Trump and you have Zelensky sitting next to each other. Zelensky says, I wasn't pressured. I didn't feel like this was the US president trying to bully me.
Nobody pushed me, yes.
In other words, no pressure.
And, you know, again, I think he says that to appease President Trump.
And he wants a meeting.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? So Zelensky gets elected in the spring of this year, and the big thing that everybody wants to happen in Ukraine is a state visit to the White House as a show of diplomatic support for Ukraine, for the new president, by the United States. And the Ukrainians really, really want this, and the administration knows they want this, and they're trying to use that as leverage to get the Ukrainians to open these bogus investigations into Joe Biden.
Now, Trump says the reason that he was giving the Ukrainian president a hard time, pressuring him, was because Ukraine is massively corrupt and because the Americans give all the aid, the Europeans aren't doing enough. How accurate are those two claims?
So point number two, not accurate. The U.S. is the only country providing military support to Ukraine, so that is true. The U.S. provides about $250 million a year to Ukraine military capabilities and capacity. But the European level of support is very high. Over the last 6 years, Europeans have provided about $15 billion with a B to support Ukraine's democratic development, other programs, on health issues, et cetera. And so the Europeans have been doing a lot. So has the United States. So that is just a false claim by Trump. On point number one about corruption, yes, there's corruption in Ukraine. In fact, the Ukrainians have fought 2 revolutions against corruption, one in 2004 and one in 2014, because they were so fed up with corruption. And Ukrainians themselves are frustrated with the situation, and they deposed basically 2 governments because they were so upset with the level of corruption. But the point is that the president was pushing the Ukrainians not to investigate corruption and get better about weeding out corruption. He was pushing them to look into the specific business dealings of Joe Biden, his top political rival. And those are 2 very different things.
Now, you have this phone call between Trump and the Ukrainian president. And basically, that's when Nancy Pelosi said, we're moving on impeachment proceedings.
Right. Yeah, well, I think what we're learning, and then this phone call encapsulates how this White House and this president think it's okay to deal in diplomatic affairs, right? Like I said, it's completely unprecedented. The schism that we see between the professional, foreign service officers and diplomats, and then these political appointees that are sort of acting on the personal interests of the president, not on the interests of the United States. And so we're learning really the extent of this huge schism that's emerging on the one hand, and we're learning increasingly that Trump wasn't just involved in asking for a quid pro quo from one foreign leader, the Ukrainian leader. We're also learning that he asked other foreign leaders to investigate his political rival. He asked the Chinese to do it. He may have asked the Australians to do it.
Which he admitted to.
Exactly.
Again, not something we're learning from. He came out and said, I asked the Chinese leader.
China should start an investigation into the Bidens, because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine.
But it's unlikely he would have admitted this if it wasn't under all of this political pressure. And I think over time, we're going to learn more and more about other individuals close to Trump, close to the White House, who probably have had business interests and business dealings in Ukraine for many, many years that we don't know about. I think we're going to learn a lot more about how this president has in various ways tried to extort favor of some other political leaders in other countries to get what he wants in our own domestic politics.
Have you heard anything from any of the Ukrainian leaders around this? How are they reacting to it? Are they talking about their connections with the Trump administration? What's coming out?
It's not really the front page news. Now here we have on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the major papers are covering this day in and day out. In Ukraine, it's pretty subdued. Ukrainians want to stay out of this whole thing. I mean, Ukraine has been trying to mind its own business, for centuries. And every time they just get pulled into the affairs of other countries. And now they're getting pulled into the affairs of the United States, and they don't want to be involved. I think the Ukrainian president and those around him tried to play this the best they could, right? They're under a huge amount of pressure. The U.S. has a huge amount of leverage over Ukraine. It's a new president, it's an untested team. There's a lot of amateurs on that team, people with not a lot of experience yet.
So on the one hand, we have all these Ukrainians that are, trying to stay away from this mess. On the other hand, you've got a lot of Americans that have been caught up in it, a lot of political professionals that you know quite well. How are they responding? Whether it's the acting ambassador or it's Kurt Volker, again, the people you know, how are they reacting to all of this?
I think there's a lesson learned here for a lot of people who are professionals who've been working on foreign policy, national security their entire careers, that if you go into this administration, you're going to get burned. You're going to get thrown under the bus because as soon as the president feels like some trouble might come to him, right, he'll throw anybody under the bus. Again, so in normal circumstances, you have somebody like Kurt Volker, who's a special envoy for Ukraine negotiations.
Appointed by Trump.
Appointed by Trump, position. Exactly.
So he was ready. He's up for it. He's like, okay, I'm ready to go and work for Trump.
And he has for quite some time, actually. Mm-hmm. He was brought in still under Tillerson to be the special envoys, and he's lasted this whole time. I think he thought he was doing the right thing, but he just got caught up in all of the shadow diplomacy being run by all of these proxies on Trump's behalf. And I think he was trying to manage it the best he could. But I think the lesson learned, if you want to save your reputation, you cannot work for this administration, because when push comes to shove, they'll just get rid of you and they'll throw you under the bus.
Now, on the other side, the non-professionals, you also have Giuliani having worked with and for the Ukrainians for the last 10 years. We have Paul Manafort, who was taking an enormous amount of money for the Ukrainians for all this time, when their regime was much more aligned with Moscow. What kind of relationships are these?
Yeah, all roads lead back to Ukraine. Manafort is in jail now because of his dealings with previous Ukrainian administration that was kind of a puppet administration of Moscow. And Giuliani, we're now finding out more and more, has been also taking clients and has various business interests in Ukraine. And I think more of this kind of information is going to keep coming out. And I think that's because, Ukraine has a problem with corruption. That's true. And in many ways, it's easier to get access to money in Ukraine by foreigners. Look at Russia. Russia is very corrupt as well, but that corruption has also been kind of consolidated and centralized around Moscow and around the Kremlin. So it's very, very difficult for foreigners to get a piece of that action. But Ukraine is still the wild, wild west. There's still a huge amount of natural resources. The state has never developed in the same way that, that you have Putin, who has a lot of control over state resources and a lot of control of the oligarchs. In Ukraine, not so. So it's still a really ripe market for foreigners who want to make quick money, who want to get involved, and they have been able to do so. That's why we're seeing more and more of these cases emerge, that people who are close to Trump have had a lot of dealings with Ukrainian oligarchs, Ukrainian companies, and have made a lot of money out of it.
So Burisma, there have been probes, not found to be corrupt, but enormous sums of money being paid to outsiders who have no idea about the sector in Ukraine. What's the difference? Explain the difference between Manafort and Hunter Biden.
Right. So the reason why Manafort is in jail now is because, one, he was getting paid by the former Ukrainian regime by stolen money through illicit funds, through corrupt means. He was acting as a foreign agent on behalf of other governments while being involved in U.S. politics at the end of the day, and he didn't disclose any of that information. So, somebody like Manafort, was out there just looking for the next penny for himself. Companies in this part of the world, not just in Ukraine, elsewhere, who are trying to clean up their act to have a better image in the West, are often hiring and bringing on respected Westerners who have a high-profile name to serve on their boards. It's a way for them to try to clean up their image, to make themselves look legitimate and clean in the eyes of Western governments and Western organizations. So in some ways, I think there are many Hunter Bidens out there, but we just don't know who they are because they don't have such a high-profile name, and they're not the son of a former vice president who's running for president now.
So it's more of an ethical issue as opposed to a legal issue.
I think so. I think at the end of the day, this is much more a question about Hunter Biden's character and to what extent he was using his name to try to make some money in a country like Ukraine and maybe elsewhere as well, versus there being some sort of legal issue here.
Okay, so we haven't talked about the Russian side of things. So here we are, all of this happening between the U.S. and Ukraine. They're calling him Monica Zelensky because he's bringing about another impeachment issue, right? But there are demonstrations going on in Ukraine opposed to negotiations and the potential for elections coming up in an occupied territory of Ukraine, Southeast Ukraine. Coincidence, I assume, in terms of timing, but how far along are we in terms of actual negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians at this point?
So the Ukrainian President Zelensky, he comes into office, again, without any political experience, and he doesn't have much of a platform when he's campaigning over the spring. I mean, his basic platform is that I'm not the other guy, right? And Ukrainians are so fed up at that point with the incumbent at the time, the guy Benjamin Petro Poroshenko, that they would have elected anybody that was an establishment. And it happens to be that Zelensky is there at the right place at the right time. And then his party now has complete control of the parliament, right? So he has more power than any other Ukrainian president has ever had since Ukrainian independence. And he has the parliament and he has his whole new team around him. But a lot of these people don't have much experience. Yet the one thing that he came in saying he really wanted to do was to end the conflict in the Donbass. These are the territories where Russia is still waging a war and it's still casualties on a weekly basis. People are getting killed. So Zelensky comes into office saying, this is my number one goal is peace. And one of the first things he does is he orchestrates this prisoner exchange, right? Between
24 prisoners on both sides. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's seen as a
Which
positive
the Americans,
move.
the Europeans not involved in. He does it directly with the Russians.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Seen as a positive move. Putin, interestingly, when Zelensky comes into office, doesn't initially call him to congratulate him. Russian television is just, you're spewing all kinds of nasty things about Zelensky when he comes into office. But now Zelensky seems to be working to actually move the relationship forward. And you mentioned the protests in Kiev, so what's been happening now? So the Russians have been wanting to have elections, so-called elections, in the occupied territories. Now, let's remember, these territories have no government. They're basically, these no man's land kind of areas, very poor, there's no government.
Russians control the border.
Russians control the border. There's weapons everywhere.
Right.
They're really becoming these high criminality zones, right? And the Russians are saying, well, we want elections here that will lead to these regions being autonomous. How can you hold elections in an area where there are weapons, where there is no government, where international observers don't have access to big parts of the territory to be able to claim these elections as free and fair, right? Yet Zelensky wants to move forward on this. And just recently, his administration said that they will move forward on holding elections in those areas. Nobody knows how they're going to do that, sometime in the spring. And Ukrainians are really upset about this, right?
So where do you think Ukraine goes from here? What's Ukraine going to look like, at the end of the Zelensky administration?
It's a great question. Now we're seeing a lot of unrest in Kiev. So he may not get that deal on some sort of settlement with Russia on the Donbass after all. I think there have been some good things the Zelensky administration has done. They've pushed through a lot of really unpopular economic reforms. Those are boring things we don't like to talk about. But they have been doing some things on that, healthcare reforms, et cetera. My hope, I like to stay optimistic about Ukraine, is that this administration, the Zelensky administration, will do the right thing.
Alina Polyakova, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've just heard from an expert on Ukraine. But how's the story playing in Little Ukraine? We headed down to that neighborhood in New York's East Village to find out.
Привіт, вітаю. We're here in Little Ukraine, a neighborhood in New York City's Lower East Side, where we're going to learn a little bit more about what Ukrainian Americans think about what's happening in their country these days. You go to Ukraine, what's the one thing you have to eat?
Of course, borscht. Yeah, that's a borscht. It's a beet soup.
Vareniki is our national dumplings. Like everybody knows how to make it.
What is your sense of what Ukrainians here think of this Trump-Zelensky thing?
For Trump, it's bad, but for us, it's like people in the world knows who is Ukraine, what is Ukraine, who is Zelensky.
It's good publicity.
I think it's in this way it's good.
The first line of the Ukrainian national anthem, because
Ukraine.
And what does that mean?
Ukraine has not yet died.
What's the story with that? Why is Ukraine so in danger of dying that they wrote a song about it?
They've been under somebody's thumb all along, for the most part Russians. Dealing with the people over there, the corruption was incredible. It's unfortunate, but 70 years under communist rule has done this to people.
You think Zelensky is going to fix that?
This is something that's going to take generations to cure.
What do you think the biggest problem is that Zelensky has to solve?
Everything. The biggest problem is like our country.
Like when you read that Ukraine is in the news because Trump is going to be impeached and Zelensky and all this stuff, what is it that you think that Americans don't get or should understand better about this story?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
I would love if people know more about Ukraine, but not on this way.
And now it's time for your puppet regime. Today, all the world is a stage, but when it comes to Brexit, the Bard seems to be losing the plot.
Hello, guten Tag. Yeah, is he here? Oh, yeah, he's here. Okay, listen. And so the United Kingdom mustn't...
What?
The United Kingdom, England and Wales and Scotland and
Scotland
Ireland.
and England are one country?
Yeah, well, they may not be soon, but let's move on, okay? And so the United Kingdom wants to leave the European Union...
Stop! The Euro... what?
Europe. All of Europe is more or less one country now.
England joined the continent? This is madness. Where did you say you were from again?
Germany.
Never heard of such a thing. It sounds dangerous.
Bill, hello. You are truly one of the greats, okay? Finally getting the recognition you so richly deserve for that movie with Ethan Hawke. Terrific.
Have you read King Lear?
Nobody understands King Lear better than me.
Indeed.
Bill, as Mr. Brexit, let me tell you, Brexit will be very, very good for the United States.
The United... what?
Public regime.
That's our show this week. Come back next week. Don't miss it. You can't miss it. You got to be here every week. That's why I do the show. And if you like what you've seen, check us out at gzeromedia.com.